nobody tells you about starting over? The old man's voice barely rose above the clatter of dishes at the Blue Plate diner. His weathered hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. That you can change your name, your city, your face in the mirror, but you can never escape the feeling of being watched. Rain streaked the windows of the South Side diner as Elias Penn sat in his usual corner booth, the one farthest from the street. His cardigan was worn but clean, pressed with the care of a man who had little left but dignity. He unfolded a newspaper with trembling fingers, the pages rustling like whispered confessions. 26-year-old Grace Miller paused mid-step, coffee pot in hand, and something in his words cut through the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. She'd been working doubles here for 3 years, ever since her mother's cancer had drained what little savings they'd scraped together, leaving her younger sister Emily's college tuition balanced on Grace's aching feet and 4 smiles. And she'd learned to recognize loneliness in all its disguises. "Decaf with honey, Mr. Penn," she said softly, refilling his cup without asking. "And I brought extra napkins. The rain always makes your hands shake worse." Elias Penn looked up at her, his pale eyes suddenly glistening with something that might have been tears, or might have been the first crack in a dam held closed for decades. You pay attention." His voice caught. "Most people look right through ghosts." Grace set down the coffee pot and met his gaze without the armor of her waitress smile. "Everyone deserves to be seen, Mr. Penn. Even ghosts." For a moment, the diner fell away, the sizzle of the grill, the laughter from the lunch counter, the Chicago rain drumming against glass. In that moment, Grace didn't know she was looking at a man who'd spent 40 years running from a past written in blood money and broken promises. She didn't know about the ledgers he'd kept for men who collected far more than debts, or the secrets that still woke him at 3 a.m. with his heart hammering against his ribs. All she knew was that someone was hurting, and she'd been raised to notice. That was 6 months ago. Since then, Elias had become part of Grace's daily rhythm, arriving precisely at 8:30 a.m., ordering the same meal, leaving a $20 tip on a $12 check, and reading his worn Bible with hands that shook a little less when she was near. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of remembering how he took his coffee would eventually bring a notorious Mafia boss to her doorstep, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, and a revelation that would transform both their lives forever. Some debts, Grace would learn, can only be repaid with kindness. And some ghosts are just waiting for permission to become human again. If you're ready to enjoy this story, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us in creating more amazing stories, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's jump right into the story. Elias Penn became as predictable as the sunrise. Every morning at 8:30 a.m., he'd push through the diner's glass door, the bell chiming his arrival like a gentle announcement that the world was still turning. Grace found herself watching for him without realizing it, the way you might glance at a clock you've learned to trust. He always wore the same rotation of 3 cardigans, navy, gray, and olive green, each one threadbare at the elbows, but pressed with meticulous care. The fabric spoke of a man who'd learned that dignity wasn't about wealth, but about showing up to your own life with intention. He'd slide into the corner booth, the one Grace had started keeping open for him even during the lunch rush, and unfold his newspaper with those trembling hands that seemed to carry the weight of years she couldn't begin to imagine. "The usual, Mr. Penn?" she'd ask, though they both knew the answer. "Please, Grace." His smile was always small, careful, like he was rationing joy he wasn't sure he deserved. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, crispy bacon, and decaf with honey. Never coffee, despite the Chicago cold that seeped through the diner's old windows. He'd eat slowly, methodically, making the meal last nearly an hour. And when Grace brought the check, always $12.47, he'd leave a crisp $20 bill tucked beneath his saucer, waving away change with a slight shake of his head. "You work too hard for too little," he'd say quietly whenever she protested. Over the months, Grace collected fragments of Elias Penn the way you might gather fallen leaves, small pieces of a larger story she couldn't quite see. He had no family who visited. No phone that rang in his pocket. Once, when she asked if he had children, his face had gone still as stone. I had a different life once. In New York. He'd stared at his coffee like it held answers. Different choices. Different man. She'd learned not to push. But she noticed things. The way he never paid with credit cards, always cash pulled from a worn leather wallet. How he flinched, just slightly, whenever police sirens wailed past on Ashland Avenue. The faded photograph he kept tucked in his Bible, corners soft with handling. For young men in sharp suits standing outside what looked like a Brooklyn social club, their faces hard with the confidence of people who'd never yet learned fear. "Which one is you?" Grace had asked once, pointing to the youngest man in the photo. Elias had closed the Bible quickly, too quickly. "Someone I stopped being a long time ago." But what struck Grace most was how he read. Every day, the same worn Bible, pages thin as tissue paper, passages underlined in fading ink. Psalm 23. Psalm 51. Matthew 6 verse 14. Verses about shepherds and valleys, about forgiveness and mercy. He'd mouthed the words silently, lips moving like prayers he'd repeated, so often they'd become muscle memory. "Do you believe in second chances, Grace?" he'd asked one morning, rain hammering the windows. She'd refilled his cup, considering. "I believe we become the chances we give other people." Elias had looked at her then with an expression she couldn't name, something between grief and hope, like a man who'd been holding his breath for 40 years and had just remembered how to exhale. "Then maybe," he'd whispered, "maybe there's hope for ghosts after all." The peculiarities accumulated slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river Grace hadn't realized she was wading through. It started with small things. The way Elias would arrive exactly when the morning shift changed, when the diner was loudest and most chaotic, as if he'd learned that chaos made the best camouflage. How he always sat with his back to the wall, eyes flickering toward the door whenever the bell chimed. The cash, always cash, pulled from different pockets as though he rotated where he kept his money. One morning, a police cruiser rolled past with sirens blaring, responding to something 3 blocks over. Elias's coffee cup clattered against the saucer, his whole body gone rigid, newspaper crumpling in his white-knuckled grip. Grace had rushed over, steadying the cup before it spilled. "Just a sound," she'd said softly. "You're safe here." He'd nodded, but his hands shook worse than usual for the rest of the meal. It was 2 weeks later, during an unusually quiet Tuesday afternoon, when Elias finally let something slip. Grace had been refilling his cup when he spoke, voice barely above a whisper, eyes fixed on something only he could see. "I spent 40 years keeping books for men who collected more than debts." The words hung in the air like smoke. "Numbers are clean, you see. They don't lie. They don't bleed. They just add up." Grace had frozen, coffee pot suspended mid-pour. Before she could respond, Elias seemed to catch himself, snapping back into the present. He'd smiled that careful smile and changed the subject to the weather, but Grace felt the weight of what he'd shared settling into her bones. That evening, her manager Frank cornered her by the register, his expression troubled. "Grace, honey, I'm saying this because I care." He nodded toward Elias's empty booth. "Don't get attached to customers with no last names. That man's been coming here for months, and we don't know anything about him except he tips too well and pays cash. People who live that quietly are usually hiding from something. Or hiding from someone," Grace had replied, surprising herself with the protectiveness in her voice. Frank had sighed. "That's what worries me." But Grace couldn't stop herself. She began saving his booth even during peak hours, placing a small, reserved sign on the table when the hostess tried to seat someone else there. When Elias looked particularly pale one morning, his skin almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent light, she'd brought him chicken soup from the kitchen, off menu, on the house. "You don't have to do this," he'd protested weakly. "I know," Grace said, setting down the bowl. "That's why it matters." She started noticing other things too. How he never mentioned doctors, despite obviously needing one. The way he'd pause before answering the simplest questions, as if calculating what was safe to reveal. The fact that in 6 months of daily visits, he never once mentioned a single person from his life, past or present, except in the vaguest terms. One morning, Grace found him staring at the photograph again, the one of the 4 young men in suits. His finger traced the face of the youngest one, himself, decades ago, with something that looked like mourning. "Do you ever talk to them?" Grace asked gently. "The people from before?" Elias closed the Bible, tucking the photo away. "The dead don't need phone calls, Grace. And the living are safer if I stay silent." Grace's chest tightened. "Mr. Penn, if you're in some kind of trouble." "Trouble found me 40 years ago," he interrupted, meeting her eyes. "I've been running from the consequences ever since. But you," his voice softened, "you make me remember what it felt like to just be a person. Not a liability. Not a ghost. Just Elias." Grace reached across the table and squeezed his trembling hand. "Then that's who you are here. Just Elias. If you believe the elderly deserve dignity and respect, not abandonment and invisibility, hit that subscribe button right now. Only the heartless and cruel scroll past without subscribing. Don't be like the people who ignored Elias for decades and left him to die alone. Subscribe and stand against those who treat vulnerable people like they're invisible." The confession came on a Tuesday night when the diner was nearly empty, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant clang of dishes being washed in the back. Grace was working a double, her feet aching, her eyes burning with exhaustion. Elias had stayed late, later than usual, nursing his 3rd cup of decaf like he was afraid to go home to an empty apartment. Grace slid into the booth across from him without asking. They'd crossed that boundary weeks ago, the invisible line between server and customer dissolving into something closer to companionship. "My mother died when I was 23, Grace said suddenly, surprising herself. She stared at her hands, the way her mother used to. "Breast cancer. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. We couldn't afford the treatments that might have made a difference. I watched her fade for 8 months, getting smaller and smaller until she was just gone." Elias's eyes glistened. "I'm sorry, Grace. I tell myself I did everything I could. But some nights..." Her voice cracked. "Some nights I wonder if I could have worked harder, saved faster, been smarter. If love should have been enough to keep her alive." "Guilt," Elias said quietly, "is the weight we carry for things beyond our control. I know something about that." Grace looked up, meeting his gaze. "Then tell me what you've been carrying." For a long moment, Elias said nothing. Then slowly he began to speak. "I was an accountant. Started young, brilliant with numbers, too ambitious for my own good. By the time I was 30, I was working for families in Brooklyn, not the kind that run grocery stores." His voice was steady now, almost clinical, like he was reading someone else's story. "The Corleone name meant something where I'm from, but there were others. The Callaways. The Russos. Men who built empires on fear." Grace's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. "I counted money stained with things I didn't want to know about. Protection rackets. Loan sharking. Worse things I convinced myself I wasn't responsible for because I only touched the numbers. Clean hands, dirty ledger." He laughed bitterly. "I told myself that for 15 years. What changed? A 15-year-old boy got caught in a debt collection. They made an example of him." Elias's jaw tightened. "I saw the photographs. I saw what my clean numbers had paid for. So I went to the FBI. Turned over everything. Names, accounts, patterns. Enough to put away 3 family heads and 24 soldiers." "Witness protection," Grace whispered. "New name, new city, new face in a mirror, just like I told you." He touched his cheek, as if remembering the man he used to be. "That was 1984. I've been Elias Penn ever since. But the man I was, Walter Kessler, he still wanted. Dead, preferably." Grace felt ice slide down her spine. After 40 years? Surely. Some debts never expire, Grace. And some men never forget. Elias's voice was hollow. "Vincent Calloway was just a teenager when I testified against his father. He watched his family empire crumble from the witness stand. Now he runs what's left of that world, and he's spent decades looking for ghosts. You think he's still searching? I know he is. Men like Vincent don't forgive. They collect. Elias reached across the table, gripping Grace's hand with surprising strength. Which is why you need to forget this conversation. Forget you know me as anything but a lonely old man who tips too much. Because if they ever connect you to me... Stop, Grace said firmly. I'm not afraid of your past, Mr. Penn. I'm only afraid of you facing it alone. Elias's composure finally cracked, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. You don't understand what you're risking. Maybe not, Grace said softly. But I understand what you'd be losing if I walked away. And I won't do that to you. Outside, Chicago rain began to fall, washing the streets clean of everything except the truth they'd just shared. The decline happened faster than Grace could have imagined, like watching a building that had stood for decades suddenly remember it was made of sand. It started with confusion. Elias would order his usual breakfast, then stare at the plate as if surprised by what had arrived. Did I already eat? He'd ask, his voice thin and uncertain. Grace would gently remind him, and he'd nod, but something behind his eyes had begun to flicker and fade. His breathing changed too. Where it had once been steady, it now came in shallow pulls, each inhale sounding like effort, like his lungs were forgetting their purpose. He'd pause mid-sentence to catch his breath, one hand pressed against his chest, as if holding something fragile in place. But it was his hands that frightened Grace most. The trembling that had always been there, subtle, manageable, became violent. His coffee cup would rattle against the saucer, so loudly other customers would turn to look. Twice, Grace caught the cup before it spilled. The third time, she wrapped both her hands around his, steadying them, and felt how cold his skin had become despite the diner's warmth. Mr. Penn, you need to see a doctor, she'd said, her voice urgent. Can't, he'd whispered. Too many questions. Too much paperwork. My name. Forget your name. You're sick. He'd smiled that careful smile, the one that broke her heart a little more each time. Grace, I've been dying since 1984. This is just my body finally catching up. 3 days later, when 8:30 came and went without the familiar chime of the door, Grace felt the absence, like a held breath. She poured coffee for other customers, took orders, smiled through the motions, but her eyes kept drifting to the empty corner booth. By noon, the held breath had become a knot of dread. She found the address tucked in an old receipt from 2 months ago, written in Elias's careful script, the handwriting of an accountant who'd once made his living in precision. 1847, West 18th Street, apartment 3B, Pilsen. Grace had never been to his home. He'd never invited her. But she left her shift early, ignoring Frank's protests, and took the bus south. The building was tired, its brick facade stained with decades of city grime. The front door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Grace climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled of old cooking oil and dampness, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knocked. Silence. Mr. Penn? It's Grace. More silence. Then, faintly, a sound like something falling. Grace tried the knob. Unlocked. She pushed the door open slowly, afraid of what she'd find. The apartment was sparse in a way that hurt to see. A single room with a kitchenette, a twin bed, a table with 2 chairs, and nothing else. No photographs on the walls. No books except the worn Bible on the nightstand. No trace of a life lived, only a life survived. Elias lay on the bed, still wearing yesterday's cardigan, his face gray as ash. His breathing was a wet rattle that filled the small room with the sound of endings. Grace. His voice was barely audible. You shouldn't be here. She crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed, taking his icy hand in hers. His pulse fluttered beneath her fingers like something trying to escape. I'm exactly where I need to be, she said, though her voice shook. And I'm not leaving. Elias's eyes filled with tears. Nobody's stayed in 40 years. Then it's about time someone did. Grace pulled out her phone, her hand trembling now too, but Elias gripped her wrist with surprising strength. No hospitals. No records. Please, Grace. Let me die as Elias Penn, not as the ghost of Walter Kessler. Grace looked at the man who'd become her daily ritual, her unexpected friend, her reminder that kindness could still matter in a world that often forgot. And she made a choice that would change everything. Then I'll stay. Right here. For as long as it takes. Grace became a ghost herself those next few weeks, slipping between two worlds, the fluorescent brightness of the diner and the dim quiet of Elias's apartment where time moved differently, measured in shallow breaths and the turning of Bible pages. She'd finish her shift at 3, take the bus to Pilsen, and climb those 3 flights of stairs with grocery bags cutting into her palms. Soup from the corner bodega. Saltines. Ginger ale. The things you feed someone whose body is forgetting how to hold onto life. Elias would be awake sometimes, disoriented, asking what year it was or calling her by names she didn't recognize. Margaret, Sarah, once even Ma. Other times he'd be lucid, painfully so, watching her move through his sparse room with eyes that held too much gratitude. You don't have to do this, he'd whisper, the same protest he'd made 100 times. I know, Grace would reply, the same answer she'd given 100 times before. She'd heat the soup on his ancient hot plate, spoon it carefully into his mouth when his hands shook too violently to hold the bowl. She'd read scripture aloud from his worn Bible, the passages he'd underlined, the verses about valleys and still waters and dwelling in the house of the Lord. Sometimes she'd just sit in the chair by his bed, holding his cold hand, listening to the wet rattle of his breathing and the distant sounds of the city below. The silence felt sacred somehow, like bearing witness was its own form of prayer. Frank cornered her in the kitchen during her 4th consecutive short shift, his face tight with frustration. Grace, I can't keep covering for you. You're exhausted. You're missing tables. Yesterday you mixed up 3 orders. He softened slightly. I get that you care about this guy, but I've got a business to run. If you can't commit to your full shifts. I understand, Grace said quietly, untying her apron. Do what you need to do. She walked out before he could respond, too tired to fight, too committed to stop. That night, her sister Emily called, her voice sharp with worry. Grace, people at the diner are talking. They're saying you're taking care of some old man with a shady past. That he might be dangerous. Emily paused. What if his past catches up with him, and you? What if whoever he's running from finds out you've been helping him? Grace looked at Elias, sleeping fitfully, his chest rising and falling in that terrible rhythm that meant each breath might be the last. Then at least he won't die alone, she said simply. That's not an answer, Grace. You can't save everyone. I'm not trying to save everyone, Em. I'm trying to save one person who needs it. Grace's voice caught. If we only help people who are safe to help, we're not really helping at all. We're just making ourselves feel better. Silence stretched across the phone line. You sound like Mom, Emily finally said, her voice softer now. Good, Grace whispered. Maybe that means she taught us something that matters. After Emily hung up, Grace returned to the chair beside Elias's bed. His hand found hers in the darkness, his grip weak but deliberate. Your mother, he murmured, half-conscious. She raised someone extraordinary. She raised someone who knows what it costs to be invisible, Grace replied. And I won't let that happen to you. Outside, the city hummed with evening traffic and distant sirens and the thousand small sounds of people living their lives. Inside apartment 3B, Grace Miller kept vigil over a dying man whose real name she'd only just learned, whose past she barely understood, and whose presence in her life had somehow become the most important thing she'd ever chosen. Even if that choice might cost her everything. For weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the light came pale and thin through the apartment window, Elias Penn stopped breathing. Grace had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand still wrapped around his, her head resting on the mattress edge. She woke to silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. The wet rattle that had filled the room for weeks had finally ceased. His face looked peaceful, younger somehow, as if death had erased 40 years of fear. His Bible lay open on his chest. The pages turned to Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Grace traced the words with her finger, her vision blurring with tears she'd been holding back for a month. "You're not a ghost anymore," she whispered. "You're free." The paramedics came. Then the coroner. Grace sat numbly through the questions, the paperwork, the official recording of a death that felt anything but official. When they asked about next of kin, the social worker shook her head. "There's no one listed. Just you, as his emergency contact." She looked at Grace with something like pity. "Did he have any family? Anyone we should notify?" Grace thought about the photograph of 4 young men in sharp suits, about a life abandoned in 1984, about Vincent Calloway searching for ghosts. "No," she said quietly. "There's no one." The funeral was held 3 days later at St. Adalbert's, a small chapel on the south side with stained glass windows that turned the morning light into something holy. Grace had arranged everything: the simple casket, the service, the burial plot in a cemetery where names didn't matter as much as the grass that would grow above them. She sat in the front pew, wearing the only black dress she owned, the same one she'd worn to her mother's funeral. The priest was kind, his words gentle and vague, speaking of redemption and mercy for a man whose life story he didn't know. Grace barely heard him. She was remembering Dieckhoff with honey, trembling hands, the way Elias had smiled when she called him by his chosen name. Only 5 people attended. Grace, the priest, 3 strangers in the back, elderly men with worn faces who said nothing but nodded at her with something that looked like respect or recognition or both. Grace wondered if they were ghosts too, if they'd known Walter Kessler in another life, if they'd come to witness the end of a man who'd managed to outlive his own past. The service ended. The priest offered final prayers. The 3 strangers slipped out quietly, disappearing into the Chicago morning like smoke. Grace stood to leave, her legs unsteady, her heart heavy with the particular grief of losing someone the world had already forgotten. Then she heard it, the low rumble of an engine outside. Too smooth, too expensive for this neighborhood. Through the chapel's open door, Grace saw it pull up to the curb, a black Lincoln Town car, its windows tinted dark, its chrome gleaming in the weak sunlight. Her breath caught. The back door opened, and a man stepped out. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace, made in 3 months. He moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having to ask permission for anything. Behind him, 2 more men emerged. One carried a leather briefcase. The other wore an earpiece and scanned the street with practiced eyes. Lawyers. Security. The machinery of power. The silver-haired man's gaze swept the chapel entrance and landed on Grace. His expression was unreadable, cold, calculating, dangerous in a way that made her skin prickle with instinct. Vincent Calloway had found his ghost, and now he was looking directly at the woman who'd held that ghost's hand as he died. Vincent Calloway moved like a man who'd never had to hurry for anything in his life. Each step up the chapel stairs was measured, deliberate, the kind of entrance designed to make people remember they were in the presence of someone who controlled rooms simply by entering them. Grace's blood turned to ice in her veins, but she forced herself to stay rooted in place. Her hands clenched at her sides, fingernails biting into her palms. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she'd made a promise to Elias, to see him through to the end, to protect what little dignity he'd carved out of 4 decades of hiding. Calloway stopped at the chapel entrance, his eyes sweeping the sparse interior with the clinical assessment of a man appraising value. The 2 lawyers flanked him like matching bookends, their faces professionally neutral. The bodyguard remained near the door, his hand resting casually near his jacket in a way that was anything but casual. So, this is what 40 years of hiding bought him. Calloway's voice was smooth, cultured, carrying the faint trace of Brooklyn that even decades of power couldn't quite erase. An empty room. 3 strangers. 1 girl who doesn't know better. The dismissal in his tone ignited something in Grace's chest, something hotter than fear, sharper than grief. She stepped forward, positioning herself between Calloway and the casket, her chin lifting despite the way her legs trembled. "He wasn't empty," Grace said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "He was loved. Maybe that's something you wouldn't understand." The chapel fell silent. Even the priest seemed to hold his breath. Calloway's eyes narrowed, his gaze sliding over Grace like she was an equation he was trying to solve. Up close, she could see the details Elias must have known. The scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the ring on his right hand that looked heavy enough to break bone, the way his jaw tightened when someone dared to speak back to him. "Loved," he repeated, tasting the word like something foreign. "By who? A waitress working doubles who knew him for what, 6 months? You think that's love, sweetheart? That's charity. There's a difference." "You're right," Grace said, surprised by her own steadiness. "There is a difference. Charity is what you give when you want something in return, gratitude, recognition, a tax write-off. Love is what you give because someone deserves to be seen as human." Elias Penn was human. Not a ghost. Not a debt. Not a target. Human. Something flickered across Calloway's face, too quick to name, gone before Grace could identify it. Surprise, maybe. Or anger. Or something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. "You don't know who I am," Calloway said quietly, and there was warning in his tone. "I know exactly who you are," Grace replied, thinking of Elias's confession, the photograph of young men in suits, the decades of fear. "You're Vincent Calloway. And Elias, Walter Kessler, spent 40 years running from you. But he's not running anymore. He's done. So whatever you came here for, revenge, closure, satisfaction, you're 40 years too late." The bodyguard shifted, his hand moving fractionally closer to his jacket. Calloway raised one hand slightly, a gesture so small it was almost invisible, but the bodyguard froze immediately. Grace realized she was watching power in its purest form, the kind that didn't need to be loud or obvious, because everyone already knew who held it. "You've got spine," Calloway said, his tone unreadable. "I'll give you that. Walter always did have a weakness for people who couldn't keep their mouths shut when they should." He glanced at the casket, his expression hardening. "But spine doesn't stop bullets, sweetheart. And neither does love." Grace felt the threat like a physical thing, cold and sharp against her skin. But she didn't move. Didn't flinch. "Then I guess we'll see what does." Calloway stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the door, his lawyers and bodyguard falling into formation behind him. At the threshold, he paused. "We're not done," he said without turning around. "I'll be seeing you soon, miss." "Miller," Grace said. "Grace Miller." "Grace," Calloway repeated softly. How fitting. Then he was gone, and Grace was left standing in the empty chapel, her legs finally giving out as she collapsed into the nearest pew, shaking with the adrenaline of having just stared down a man who'd built an empire on fear. 2 weeks passed like held breath. Grace returned to her shifts at the Blue Plate Diner, moving through the familiar motions, pouring coffee, taking orders, wiping down tables. But Elias's empty booth felt like a wound that wouldn't close. Frank had restored her hours without comment, perhaps sensing that whatever storm had passed through her life had fundamentally changed her in ways he couldn't quite name. She was refilling the coffee station during the lunch rush when the bell above the door chimed, and the diner's ambient noise seemed to dim like someone had turned down the volume on the world. Vincent Calloway walked in, flanked by the same 2 lawyers from the funeral. He wore a different suit, navy this time, just as expensive, and his presence transformed the shabby diner into something that suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Grace's hands began to shake, the coffee pot trembling in her grip. She set it down carefully, afraid she'd drop it, and forced herself to meet Calloway's gaze as he approached the counter. "Miss Miller," he said, his tone neutral, professional. "We need to talk. Privately, if possible." Frank emerged from the kitchen, his expression darkening. "Grace, you want me to?" "It's fine," Grace said quietly, though her voice wavered. "We can use the back booth." She led them to Elias's corner booth, a choice she made deliberately, defiantly, and slid into the seat where she'd spent 6 months learning to see a ghost as human. Calloway sat across from her, the lawyers settling in beside him like sentries. One of them opened a leather briefcase, the sound of the clasps unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "I'm not here to threaten you," Calloway began, and Grace almost laughed at how terrifying that sentence sounded coming from him. "I'm here as the executor of Walter Kessler's, Elias Penn's estate." Grace blinked. Estate? He lived in a one-room apartment in Pilsen. He had nothing. "That's not entirely accurate." Calloway nodded to the lawyer, who withdrew a manila folder and slid it across the table. Before he entered witness protection, Walter transferred certain assets into a blind trust. Property, investments, cash reserves he'd managed to hide from the families. It's been accruing value for 40 years. Grace stared at the folder like it might bite her. "He left it all to you," Calloway continued, his voice carefully controlled. "A brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Current valuation is approximately $2.3 million, plus another $400,000 in investment accounts." The diner spun. Grace gripped the table edge, her knuckles white.
"Why?"
"Why me?" The second lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Penn left a letter. He requested it be read to you in the presence of Mr. Calloway." He unfolded a single sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakably Elias's, careful, precise, the penmanship of an accountant who'd once made his living in accuracy. The lawyer began to read. "Grace, if you're hearing this, I've finally stopped running. Thank you for making my last months feel like living instead of just surviving. You gave me what my world never could: dignity without price, attention without agenda. I was a ghost, and you made me human again. The money, the property, it's yours. Not because you earned it or deserve it in some transactional sense, but because you proved that kindness doesn't need a ledger. Use it however you wish. Build something good. You already know how." The lawyer paused, then continued, his tone shifting slightly. "Vincent, if you're reading this, you know the life we led. You watched your father build an empire on fear, and I helped him count the cost. I'm leaving my fortune to Grace Miller to prove that in the end, what we build with kindness matters more than what we take with fear. You taught me the value of loyalty. She taught me the value of being seen. Maybe there's a lesson in that for both of us." "Walter." Silence filled the booth. Grace's vision blurred with tears she couldn't contain. Calloway sat motionless, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point past Grace's shoulder. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked less like a man who controlled rooms and more like someone who'd just been struck by something he hadn't seen coming. "He always did know how to twist the knife," Calloway said finally, his voice rough. "Even from the grave." Grace watched Vincent Calloway's carefully constructed mass crack, the fissures spreading across his face like ice breaking under pressure. His jaw worked silently, his hands, those hands that had signed orders and counted debts, trembled slightly against the table. "He was the only one who ever looked at me like I was worth saving," Calloway said finally, his voice stripped of its usual authority. "My father saw an asset. My mother saw a disappointment. But Walter, he caught himself. Elias. He used to tell me I was smart enough to build something better. I thought he was weak for running. Now I wonder if he was the only one brave enough to try." Grace felt something shift in her chest, a softening she hadn't expected. This man, this dangerous, powerful man, suddenly looked like every other person she'd ever served who carried regrets too heavy to name. "He didn't think you were beyond saving," Grace said quietly. "That's why he left you that letter. He wanted you to know there's another way." Calloway met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw past the scar and the expensive suit to something raw and searching underneath. "Teach me," he said, and the words sounded like surrender. "Teach me how he saw the world through your eyes. I've spent 30 years taking. I don't know how to give." The partnership formed slowly, like trust always does, one careful conversation at a time. Calloway liquidated portions of his less visible assets. Grace contributed Elias's inheritance, every dollar a testament to the man who'd believed in second chances. Together, they transformed the Brooklyn brownstone into something neither of them could have built alone. Penn's Haven opened on a gray Tuesday morning, its doors unlocked for the first time in decades. The brownstone's bones were good. High ceilings, original hardwood, rooms that remembered when Brooklyn neighborhoods were built for families instead of portfolios. But Grace and Calloway had made it into something more, a sanctuary for elderly former informants, witnesses in protection, reformed criminals seeking the peace that had eluded them for lifetimes. The first resident was a 78-year-old woman named Rosa who testified against her own son's trafficking ring. She arrived with a single suitcase and eyes that had forgotten how to trust. Grace made her tea, Earl Grey with honey, the way Rosa's mother used to, and sat with her in the front room until the shaking stopped. "You're safe here," Grace had said simply. "You're seen." By the end of the first year, Penn's Haven housed 12 ghosts learning to become human again. Calloway visited every week, sitting in the common room, listening to stories he would have once silenced. Grace watched him transform, not overnight, not completely, but in small, deliberate ways. The way he remembered names. The way he asked questions and waited for answers. The way he looked at people as if they mattered beyond what they could offer him. One evening, as autumn light slanted through the brownstone's tall windows, Grace stood beside Calloway on the front steps. The street hummed with Brooklyn life, neighbors greeting each other, children laughing, the ordinary music of a world that kept turning. "Elias would be proud," Calloway said quietly. Grace thought about a corner booth in a South Side diner, about trembling hands and decaf with honey, about the profound weight of being seen. "We're not defined by the world we're born into," she said, "but by the world we choose to build. And sometimes one act of seeing someone can change everything." Calloway nodded, his eyes glistening. Behind them, through the brownstone's warm windows, 12 people who'd spent lifetimes running had finally found a place to rest. The debt was paid. The ghost was free. And Grace, the kind that asks for nothing in return, had rewritten everything. If you believe in the power of redemption and second chances, subscribe to this channel right now. Comment compassion over cruelty if you believe kindness is stronger than violence and that people deserve a path back to humanity. If you refuse to side with the cold-hearted mobsters and ruthless criminals who see people as transactions instead of humans, drop that comment and hit subscribe right now. This is your moment to stand against the Vincent Calloways of the world, the manipulators, the exploiters, the ones who build power on broken lives. Comment compassion over cruelty, subscribe, and prove you're not one of them.